To begin, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the various lands on which we're gathered today and the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people watching. I pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and recognise and celebrate the diversity of Aboriginal peoples and their ongoing cultures and connections to the land and waters. Hello and welcome to all our attendees and presenters. I'm Kate Concannon, your MC for the session. I lead the Institute's National Education team and I'm speaking to you from the Institute's New South Wales home at Tusculum on Gadigal country. Thank you for joining us today. I'm very pleased to welcome you back to be part of this second instalment in our 4-part First Nations Competency Crash Course, where we'll be looking closely at the new national competencies relating to First Nations. Today, we're very privileged to be hearing directly from authors of the new competencies, as well as from the head of the AACA, the body that owns the National Standard of Competency for Architects. This is a really valuable opportunity to engage directly with Kathleen, Danielle and Sarah, whom I'll introduce shortly. And I encourage you to ask questions at the end of the presentations when we'll have some time for Q&A. You'll see on your screen that the Q&A function is activated, but please hold off on posting your questions there until the presentations are completed, because you may find your question is answered in the course of the presentations. So then when we get started with the Q&A, pop a summary of your question or your comment in the box, and then just wait for the prompt to unmute and we'll invite you to ask your question directly. If you're signed in anonymously, I'll endeavour to ask the question on your behalf. And if you'd prefer not to speak directly in any case, just let us know when you post in the box. So to get started, let me introduce our first presenter for today's session, Kathleen Loseby, CEO of Architects Accreditation Council of Australia, AACA. Kathleen has over 30 years of practice in the architectural profession, balanced with a business acumen secured by the principles learnt from an MBA and GAICD. Her experience has been across various building typologies for design, documentation and site services. These include hotel, apartment, residential, commercial, education, aged care, hospital, industrial and heritage buildings. She has appreciated multiple perspectives from experience working for US, UK and Australian businesses. This includes Foster & Partners, SOM, AJ&C, Turner and Crone. Kathleen is a Life Fellow and former President of the New South Wales chapter of the Australian Institute of Architects, in which capacity I will attest as New South Wales State Manager at the time. She served the profession with phenomenal effort and efficacy at an absolutely critical time of industry reform. And in leading the further development and rollout of the new competencies, Kathleen is continuing to evolve the profession. So over to you, Kathleen.
Thanks, Kate, and thanks for that very nice encouragement there. Okay, so sharing my screen, I hope that's working.
It is.
Great. So what can you expect from this presentation? I have 4 main areas which I will cover today before I hand over to the capable hands of Danielle and Sarah, who'll go through the detail. The first one is why we have competency standards, how they are developed and revised, what the 8 First Nation competencies are, and where you can find assistance and understand what will be expected of you. So to assist in this, the resources that you need, you can find on our website. So if you go to aaca.org.au, go to the tab that's called National Standard, and from there you'll be able to download the 2021 National Standard of Competency for Architects and also the 2021 NSCA explanatory notes. Both of these items will be very worthwhile for you to understand what the expectations are. So the 2021 National Standard of Competency is an A3 document. This is what it looks like. And the explanatory notes are an A4 document, and this is what that looks like. So first of all, who is the AACA? The Architects Accreditation Council of Australia is a private company. We were set up by the 8 registration boards in 1972. We're part of, we've conformed to the Corporations Act and we report to ASIC. We're a not-for-profit organisation. We're completely self-funded and we do everything through the National Standard of Competency for Architects, which we manage. And fundamentally, like the architect registration boards, we're here for consumer protection. So what are these competencies and why are they important? Basically, the competencies describe what is reasonably expected of a person who can demonstrate the standard of skill, care, and diligence that is widely accepted in Australia as a competent and professional architect. In terms of those who are registered architects, it's really worthwhile to use as a framework in which you can assess and assist individuals so you can continue to learn throughout your career, you develop particular technical skills, and you can keep pace with what changes and innovations are in the profession. Professional competencies protect the consumer, and ultimately this is what it's about. So the consumer, and the consumer is your client, but it's also ultimately anybody that uses your buildings. They can rely and they can trust on the expertise and the competence of professional architects. We do this in the competencies under 3 main competency profiles. The first one and the first step is the accreditation of the Master's Architecture. The second is at the registration level. And the third is for post-registration. And generally you will use these to track against to make sure that your CPDs are actually valid. So how frequently are these competencies reviewed or changed? The answer to that is typically every 5 to 7 years, with the first competency starting in 1993. It was initiated by the Royal Australian Institute of Architects, who realised that other countries around the world had competency standards. And it was at the same time where the federal program under Bob Hawke, who was the Prime Minister at the time, realised that we needed national competency standards for Australian professions. And in particular, it's because we had a huge burst of immigration and people coming through as professionals. So if you were to Google professional standards in Australia, you'll see that the principal ones started in 1993, and architects were the first cab off the boards, so to say. At the same time as Engineers Australia, medical scientists, optometrists, and then the following year, 1994, pharmacists and other professions started to come through. The first one in 1993 was then updated in 2001, and then you can see 2008, 2015, 2021. Obviously, you can understand why they need to be updated. If we still have the same competencies from 1993, we all can see how much the profession has changed in that time frame. So how are the 2021 competencies different to the ones that you were using? And the ones that you were using was the 2015. Fundamentally, they look different. So we've streamlined from the 2015 had 70 performance criteria, and we now have 60 in the 2021. The 2015 grouped them vertically under the AACA program names, which was APE, NPRA, OQA, etc., which probably means nothing to most of you. So sensibly now they are actually sorted into 3 distinct areas. The first one being the university qualification, then at registration, and then post-registration. For the CPDs, you will need to refer to your specific architect registration board in your state or territory as to whether the 2021 NSCA is being used now or still the 2015. All states and territories will roll into the 2021, but not all of them have actually adopted it at this point. The principal difference, and I'll just indicate this so visually on the screen, you can see on the left is at the graduation level. So that's the accreditation of universities. Most students are probably not aware because it isn't the individual that is assessed, it's the university provider that is assessed at that point. But they're assessed on what a graduate, the minimum graduate, will know and have a competency to pass. The next one in the middle, which is red, is at the point of registration. So this is what candidates for registration, so anyone that does the architectural practice exam, this is the competency level that they're expected to pass. And finally, post-registration, so everyone who is a registered architect, this will be the go-to that you use in terms of assessing whether your CPDs are valid. Fundamentally, the competencies are the same as they were in 2015. They've been reorganised so that they're presented in a clearer manner, but we have actually introduced extensions in certain areas. The first one being First Nations. There are 8 performance criteria that are completely new in this performance criteria. The second is we've extended sustainability. And the third is extension in National Construction Code, although here we refer to them as standards and codes. What influenced these changes? So the actual 2021 National Standard of Competencies that we had now started in 2018. It was decided that there needed to be an update on the seminal research on architectural education of 2008, which was authored by Professor Michael Oswald and Anthony Williams. And that document needed to be expanded not just on education, but also into architectural practice. So we set up an expert reference group and a research team, and collaborating with that were state architect registration boards, the Government Architects Network, all 21 of the accredited universities at that time through ADBED and AASA, and the Australian Institute of Architects and Association of Consulting Architects. There were questionnaires and focus groups with students and practicing architects so that we could truly understand where the state of the profession is in terms of education and practice. That resulted in this report called the Architectural Education and the Profession in Australia and New Zealand in December 2019. Now we took that document, and then to develop the competency standards took an 18-month period to review. So that involved again setting up an expert reference group. That was 5 nominees from these 5 organisations. We had a representative from the Association of Architecture Schools of Australasia, the Association of Consulting Architects, the Architects Registration Boards nominated a person with current practical experience, the Australian Institute of Architects, and the Australian Deans of the Built Environment and Design were unable to nominate somebody. So in their place, the Architect Registration Boards nominated a person with experience of regulation. Now, we then went through research, data collection, benchmark studies, and analysis. We put together a survey that went out in 2020 for stakeholder input, further analysis, that created an issues paper that went out again, stakeholder input analysis, created the first draft NSCA that went out, stakeholder input, second draft, and then eventually in July 21, we released the National Standard of Competency for Architects. So as you see, a 2.5-year period in order to truly work out where the state is of the profession and where our competencies needed to be to demonstrate what a competent professional should be. I've included in here a link to our webpage for anybody that wants to look up those surveys, the data results, the previous drafts, the full history of who was involved. That information is all available on our website. So we also had to look at where legislation and government reports were at the time. And again, we're talking now about those 3 areas that had to be either new or extended. In regard to the National Construction Code, we had in February 2018, the Shergold-Weir report, the Building Confidence report, and it was quite damning on the National Construction Code's competence within the entire construction industry, the whole construction and design industry. Then we had climate change. So we looked and analysed the federal and Commonwealth, where we have 5 acts, regulations and codes. And then in regard to states and territories, we had Environmental Planning Protection Acts of 5 of those, and the other 3 were climate change acts. Beyond those, we had further acts, regs, strategy, framework policies and action plans. And then for First Nations in federal and Commonwealth, we had 3 acts and 1 policy. We also had in the states and territories, so we had either an Aboriginal Heritage or Land Rights Act. And then there were further acts, regs, policies and protocols. And of course, also we had the New South Wales Government Architect with the draft Connecting with Country and Designing with Country. Clearly, all of these 3 needed to be updated in the competencies in order to make sure the profession was acting at the competent level. So we needed specialised advisors for this. For the climate change, we relied on the AIA's Climate Action Sustainability Task Force. And for the First Nations performance criteria, we relied on the AIA's First Nation Advisory Working Group. It's really important for the profession to know and understand that the First Nations performance criteria were written by the First Nations Advisory Working Group, and there were absolutely no edits. So all other competencies had gone through multiple stakeholders, feedback, expert reference groups, but the First Nations competencies weren't. I have to admit, the first track we did and went back to the advisory group to find, embarrassingly, from a white perspective, we had interpreted things incorrectly. And so acknowledgement to the First Nations Advisory Group, who said, no, these need to be written such a way, and we acknowledge that. And so that's what we see now. We have asked and are thankful that Sarah Lynn Rees, who's presenting later in this presentation and is the co-chair of the First Nations Advisory Working Group, is on the AACA's National Advisory Panel. And this is so that we can make sure that our programs and documentation actually conforms and is appropriate to what is required by the First Nations Advisory Working Group. So let's drill down now into what those 8 performance criteria are for First Nations. Now, the first one is PC3. This is performance criteria 3. Now you will see, I'm bringing you back again to see the 3 competency profiles. We've got on graduation, at point of registration, and post-registration. So if you look at performance criteria 3 on graduation, you can see that it says understand the principles of project planning, considering implications for country, environmental sustainability, communities, stakeholders, and project costs, with the emphasis on the active word at the beginning being understand the principles. If we then move to the point of registration, you can see the active word becomes demonstrate understanding. And then if we move to post-registration, so at the point where you are a registered architect, we are now looking at the active word of apply the principles of project planning. Now, if I go through all of these, I'll explain them all at that middle point, at point of registration, which is typically for most of them the same as at registration. So performance criteria 8 is be able to implement culturally responsive and meaningful engagement processes that respect the importance of country and reciprocal relationships with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples across architectural services. Now, I'll be going through and listing all of these, but later in the presentation, Danielle and Sarah will actually run through what do they actually mean? How can you demonstrate it? Where can you find information? PC 15 is comply with legal and ethical obligations relating to legislated requirements in relation to copyright, moral rights, and importantly here, authorship of cultural knowledge and intellectual property requirements across architectural services. PC 17 is have an understanding of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people's aspirations to care for country and how these inform architectural design. PC 27, understand how to embed the knowledge, worldviews, and perspectives of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples shared through engagement processes into the conceptual design in a meaningful, respectful, and appropriate way. PC 36 is be able to apply creative imagination, design precedents, emergent knowledge, critical evaluation, and continued engagement with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples to produce a coherent project design. This should be resolved in terms of supporting health and wellbeing outcomes for country, site planning, formal composition, spatial planning, and circulation as appropriate to the project brief and all other factors affecting the project. 45 is be able to nominate and integrate quality and performance standards with regard to selected materials, finishes, fittings, components of systems, considering the impact on country and the environment and the whole life carbon impact of the project. This includes integrating life cycle assessments and other expertise and advice from consultants, And PC50, be able to continue engagement with relevant Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples throughout all stages of the project and at its delivery in a meaningful, respectful and appropriate way. Now, there's also an additional 5 cultural performance criteria, which are not specifically First Nations, but may be able to use to assist in certain areas. So we have performance criteria 12, which is to provide independent, culturally responsive and objective advice in accordance with relevant building codes, standards, technical specifications, guidelines, planning regulations, including climate change implications across all aspects of architectural practice. Performance criteria 26, which is be able to undertake site, cultural and contextual analysis as part of preliminary design research. And then we have 29, 30 and 34. So 29 is be able to develop and evaluate design options in terms of the heritage, cultural and community values embedded in the site and in relation to project requirements. Be able to explore options for siting of a project, including integrating information and analysis of relevant cultural, social and economic factors. And finally, performance code 34, to communicate conceptual proposals and associated information to client, stakeholders and communities using appropriate and culturally responsive methods appropriate to different audiences. So where can you get assistance to understand this? This is where you need to look at our explanatory notes. You will find on pages 8 to 10 several pages that explain specifically understanding country, and every First Nations performance criteria has a detailed page. So that's all 8 of them. That's 3, 8, 15, 17, 27, 36, 45 and 50. Now these explanatory notes, actually, we don't cover all of the performance criteria. We only cover 26 at the moment. This is the first time we've introduced this document and we intend to grow it year by year. Again, just to remind you how to find these, go to our website, go to the tab that says National Standard. You'll then be able to find the 2021 NSCA and the 2021 NSCA explanatory notes. So that's it for me. I will now hand over to Kate to introduce Sarah and Danielle. Thank you.
Thanks so much for that, Kathleen. Yes, so to introduce Dr. Danielle Hromek and Sarah Lynn Rees. Dr. Danielle Hromek is a saltwater woman of the Budawang tribe of the Yuin Nation with French and Czech heritage. Danielle is a spatial designer and country-centred designer. She's the first Indigenous person in Australia to achieve a PhD in built environment and spatial disciplines. Her research and experience contributed to the Connecting with Country framework and Designing with Country discussion piece by the Government Architect New South Wales. As Director of Jinjama, Danielle's methodologies lead their approach to working with country. Her work as a researcher, educator and cultural advisor brings country, culture and community to the built environment by creating spaces to substantially affect Indigenous rights and culture. Her clients include state and local government, museums and galleries, as well as industry, including architects, planners, designers, heritage and engineering firms. Danielle's research work considers indigeneity in the built environment. It contributes an understanding of the Indigenous experience and comprehension of space and investigates how Aboriginal people occupy, use, narrate, sense, dream and contest their spaces. Welcome, Danielle. Sarah Lynn Rees is also joining us today. Welcome, Sarah. Sarah is a Palawa woman from Tasmania. She practices architecture at Jackson Clements Burrows Architects, where she's also a lead Indigenous advisor in architecture and design. She's a program advisor and curator of the Black Architecture series for M Pavilion, the director of Parla, Women Equity Architecture, and a member of the Victorian Design Review Panel for the Office of the Victorian Government Architect. Sarah teaches at Monash University, sits on the Institute's Victorian Chapter Council, co-chairs the Institute's First Nations Advisory Working Group, and is a member of the AACA National Advisory Panel. Sarah's practice, advisory and research interests are geared towards a long-term aim of indigenising the built environment. Over to you, Danielle and Sarah.
Thank you.
Thank you. Danielle, do you feel tired when people list?
Yeah, I'm overwhelmed. And then I went, I forgot that one.
All right, I'm going to share the screen. If I go, oops. Okay, so does that come up in full screen?
Yes.
Yes, perfect. So Daniel and I are going to tick tack on this presentation, and thank you for the introduction, and thank you, Kathleen. I think the relationship that we formed over the development of these is one that we truly treasure. So thank you very much for always making space for this important conversation to be a part of the narrative. So as was mentioned, the AIA First Nations Advisory Working Group engaged with the AACA on the development of the First Nations performance criteria, and this was the makeup of the group at the time. And I just want to shout out and make a special acknowledgement to Carol and Louis, as Carol, Lou and myself were predominantly leading that project with immense support from everybody else, in the group. And then we have Danielle. Danielle, do you want to introduce yourself any more than has already been introduced? No? Okay. So Danielle works with, oh, sorry, there's fire trucks, with the AACA and also with the AIA to enact a lot of the work that is strategically decided upon within the First Nations Advisory Working Group. And in this instance, was contracted to write the explanatory notes, which are wonderful. And if you ever ask yourself the question where to start, go there. Because there's an extensive amount of information that's been provided in that document, including the definitions and including a wider explanation and links to additional resources. And Danielle led that and really enacted that process. So please do seek those out, because they will give you all the information that you need in order to start the process. I won't dwell on this too much because Kathleen's already talked about it, but again, we will be referencing these two documents, so the standards and the explanatory notes, but predominantly we'll be leading in with the explanatory notes, and we'll give you a small overview of these. At the front end of the document, there's several pages of definitions, and we'll touch on these a little bit today as we work through. But please feel free to reference these and look them up, because they will give you context as to what is intended by those terms and words when reading the performance criteria and the explanatory notes. And then this is how the explanatory note is set out. So if you look at the top, as you would have seen with Kathleen's explanation, there's the graduate at the point of registration and post-registration. So in this talk, we'll be focusing particularly on registration and post-registration, as we've already done a talk that's available online for at the point of graduation. We'll focus today on this expanded explanation of what the performance criteria means and touch on some of these terms as relevant. And then we won't touch on this today, but I would encourage everyone in the group to have a look at an example of how the PC could be assessed. So that's particularly at the point of registration, but also what it might mean in the context of practice. Additionally, there are a number of other resources that are linked up on the top right-hand side of the page. And we're also in the process, and Danielle's in the process of developing a hub of information that will sit on the AIA's website, and that won't be behind any sort of paywall. That will be open and available for everyone to access. So that will be up hopefully soon, but we'll keep you posted on that one. So I think the way that we're going to run this is I'm just going to quickly outline what the performance criteria is. So you'll hear this twice, but that's the way storytelling works. You hear it multiple times, and then after a few times it sinks in. And then I'll hand over to Danielle to talk about the expanded explanatory note. And then we'll pick up on anything that we think might need to be expanded a little bit more after each one. I think we will end up focusing on the first ones for a little bit longer. And I say that because they really set up the rest of them. And when you start to drill into these, you'll notice that they sort of exist in streams. There'll be a series of performance criteria that are about the health and wellbeing of country. There'll be a series that are about engagement. And then there's a few others which are sort of standalone, particularly the authorship of cultural knowledge, for example. So it really steps through, and the structure of the document and the explanatory notes and performance criteria from 1 to 60 step through the process of a building coming to life, both in terms of the ethics of your practice and planning a project through to construction at the end. So too do follow the performance criteria. To reinforce what Kathleen said before, there is a difference in terms of an expected level of competency based on graduation, registration, and post-registration. So in this instance, performance criteria 3 is either demonstrate understanding of at registration, or for post-registration, apply principles of project planning, considering implications for country, environmental sustainability, community stakeholders, and project costs. So Danielle, would you be happy to expand on that a little bit more?
Of course. The way that I looked at this is what creating an understanding of what is your due diligence in relation to country in particular, but also communities and in particular First Nations communities. I also wanted to set up an understanding of what does caring for country mean, what does country mean? And so within this first explanatory note, which is a bit longer than the others, you'll find it does hit on a lot of those questions, and it gives you links back to a variety of definitions, if you want to call it that. I find it very strange to create a definition of country. Just to be clear, I don't think it's definable, but I've written as best I can what it means in a generic way. I think it's also about understanding like how are we going to be sustaining this country and planning that from the first moment, and starting that as part of the journey right at this first moment. So this is about doing your due diligence like you would with every other project, understanding the context in a greater way than probably has been to date, which is going to foreground all of the other work that happens on a project. It's also about understanding how the work that you're doing is going to create impacts on country and what the implications are for that country, and how you're going to find out, or we're going to start to find out about what those impacts are. Anything you wanted to add, Sarah?
I was just going to say, do you want to give an example of what an impact on country might be that someone would be looking for?
Yeah, a good example is understanding how water can be impacted. For instance, water is connected everywhere. So if you impact the water in one place and change the flow of water, which happens a lot, we've noticed, then you are impacting everything else downstream. So that's what an impact on country might be. And it's understanding that by changing a flow of water, by disenabling it from accessing the ground, you are impacting country, you're impacting the people who would access the water later on. And you would also impact non-humans who require access to that water. So non-humans might be animals or plants or other microbes that need water, or even the broader ecology that needs water to circulate. That's just a general example.
And I guess to add to that, it's also, as you noted, the due diligence, and Kathleen noted the legislations before in every state, particularly the acts that look after cultural materials. So when we say cultural material, that's artifacts. It's a better word for artifacts that you that might be present in the landscapes that you're working within. So I would say this one really focuses on two streams. One is looking backwards in terms of the heritage of a site and the protection of that place, and ensuring that what you do doesn't impede on that, as an example of implications for country, but then also looking forward about the opportunities and the possibilities and building that into the plan for your project. And sometimes that will come to you with the EOI, the RFT that will already be established. Sometimes it won't. So it's about understanding your own ethics for a project and how you're going to approach it in that context too. Anything else, Danielle, on this one?
I think that each state will have its own legislation, and I think it's about understanding where you go for that legislation as well. And without speaking for all states, each of them will have something about Aboriginal heritage or land rights or that sort of thing, and some of them have multiples, and understanding all of those and how they impact the project is important.
So PCO 8 at graduation is understand how, but at registration, these are both the same. So be able to implement culturally responsive and meaningful engagement processes that respect the importance of country and reciprocal relationships with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples across architectural services.
This is about really understanding what meaningful engagement is, and how that can be undertaken. This is about understanding the relationships that those communities. I'm sorry, it's very noisy here. If you can hear it, can you let me know and I'll shut the window? Maybe that one. Sorry, somebody's shutting the window for me. So it's about understanding how those deep relationships are part of that country and therefore need to be responded to through a process of engagement, and planning that engagement from the very first moments of a project, and including it as part of not just the inputs to the project, but the potential, but the outcomes as well, and the ongoing relationships of that place that exist irrespective of the changes. And how can you enable those relationships, I guess, is a good question to come out of this or answer.
Do you want to talk a little bit about what meaningful engagement means and what engagement in a culturally safe way means? Yeah,
I do. Look, Aboriginal community and Torres Strait Islander communities, I'm sure, have had a bad time with consultation. And so it's a bit of a dirty word in a lot of our communities. And so it's about making that more relational, and so that it's not just go in and grab the stuff you need and then leave and never talk to us again. In part, that's what cultural safety is. It's more than this, but in part, it's about understanding that engagement with First Nations people can't just be a dash and grab. It has to be a meaningful, genuine, ongoing relationship. Yes, this is complex in these spaces, and I won't pretend that it's not, because I work in them myself. But it does mean that projects are coming out with much more meaningful outcomes as well. So hopefully you take it in that light. Now, cultural safety, a lot of people haven't heard of cultural safety, because unless you live in a minority community, you probably don't have to deal with it, because you live in a space and a society that's been designed for your ways of knowing the world. So cultural safety is about ensuring that everybody's values, everyone's ways of identifying, everyone's ways of seeing the world are not only acknowledged but embraced, and that they feel that they have belonging in that places and in the spaces that you design as a result. It's much more complex than this. We're doing some work around this in the AIA. There's a framework that we're developing, which is starting to be, I don't know exactly when it's going to come out, but it's well worth watching out for that. And I've done some writing for the architecture medias. So if you're interested in cultural safety, I hope you would be, have a look for some work that's coming out very soon.
I think it's super useful as a way to answer the question that probably you get asked as well as I do a lot, Danielle, of, well, not necessarily asked, but what we see of people being paralysed by fear of not wanting to do or say the wrong thing. Cultural understanding, cultural safety, and what your responsibility is in terms of how you act is a way to move through that, because it gives you the tools to be able to go, okay, if I'm going to be a culturally safe person, I need to do these things and not do these things.
It is, and it's also about understanding those levels of cultural competence. There's a lot of research that's been done into cultural competence. It's very interesting for me because as somebody who works across a lot of different spaces, we find that cultural safety isn't just an individual personal thing, it's also in organisations, and you can find that certain organisations can be stuck in cultural blindness where they think treating everyone the same is cultural safety. It's actually not, because not everyone starts from the same position. But if you're interested in that, get in touch. I'm very interested in that. But cultural competence is some training you can do. I can't do the training for you, but I'm very, very interested in the levels of cultural competence, and we should all be aiming for at least competence in our actions with First Nations people, but also with everybody.
While we're still on this one, Danielle, do you want to talk about definitions around reciprocal relationships?
Yeah. So this is about, again, about not just sort of doing a dash and grab and not benefiting those who have given usually an awful lot of sharing and information into the process. So it's, yes, paying them properly. They are experts in their field. Whoever you're talking to in an engagement process, they're an expert. Assume you need to pay them like an expert. But also that there's some other benefits. Like if you're benefiting, if the broader community are benefiting, so should the First Nations community be benefiting from any project. And that needs to be designed into the project, just like an engagement plan needs to be designed in. It should be really well considered. And how those benefits are going to come back to the community, including the First Nations community, needs to be planned. And this is why this is one of the first performance criteria, I think.
I think the other one that's really important to clarify here too is the difference between traditional custodians, or not the difference, but similarity and difference between traditional custodians and knowledge holders.
Yeah, so we use traditional custodians in our practice, and I think that's a general thing that is moving more away from traditional owners. They're often the same thing, but it's to respond to the understanding of ownership, which in an indigenous way is not the same as a Western way. So it's not a propriety ownership, it's a custodial ownership. So that's why it's called custodian. And those are the people who have a bloodline connection to a place. It means that in some way their DNA is connected to that place. I don't know how to put it in any other way, but they literally are of that place. They come from that place. Now, a knowledge holder, they will hold knowledge about a specific topic, and it can be about a traditional topic, for instance, a weaving, for instance, but it can be something more contemporary, like we can have knowledge holders in architecture now as well, because just like every other culture, Aboriginal culture has evolves and it changes, and so does our capacity to hold knowledge. And they're sort of experts, but it's a bit different than just being an expert. They hold knowledge and they have a responsibility to that knowledge. They have a responsibility to share it in the right way, and to share it not only with people like you, but also with their own community. And so it's a two-way sharing process between community and industry and other non-Indigenous people.
I think the last point to make on this one, and I'll just highlight it with the mouse, is actually it starts by asking each group or individual how they like to be engaged. And that really requires that relationship at the beginning of a project, or an ongoing relationship with community, to understand how, or traditional custodians or knowledge holders to understand how they like to be engaged. And you might not have that on the first project that you work on, and don't beat yourself up about it, but you will gain that over time and you'll develop that relationship over time. But I know for this one particularly, Danielle, we talked about the idea of how people might learn, particularly when they've not worked in this space before. And there is a myriad of resources out there of different forms of engagement types. Like you mentioned at the beginning, consultation's a dirty word. And then you've got everything in between: co-design, collaboration, all the way up to probably partnership, which is probably typically held as the strongest one. And each of those have different definitions and different ways of working. None of them are wrong, except perhaps consultation, in the context of how consultation's been done. And each project and each traditional owner group will likely want to be engaged in a different way. So I guess the first step is actually understanding all the different types of engagement that you could do, so that when you're then speaking with traditional owners about how they might want to be engaged, or traditional custodians, that you at least have an awareness that there is actually different ways that people will want to engage in a project. Like, for example, one traditional owner group where I am has 3 family groups, and there'll always need to be a representative of those 3 family groups present, whereas a neighbouring group has a senior elder who can speak on behalf of that community. And then the group over from them actually involves young people and children in engagement processes, because their perspective is that the future is those young people. And so and that's a way to transfer knowledge between the knowledge holders and the young people through the process of engagement of a building. So different groups will want to engage in different ways, and the only way to know is to ask. Keep moving.